For 6 months, I brought breakfast to an old man every single morning. A peanut butter sandwich, a banana, coffee, and a thermos. 6:15 a.m. without fail at the same bus stop where he slept. I was 22, black, working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over my head. He was 68, white, homeless, telling stories nobody believed. Then one morning, everything changed. 3 military officers knocked on my apartment door at dawn. Dress uniforms. A colonel standing at attention on my cracked doorstep. When I opened the door, still in my hospital uniform, exhausted from a double shift, my heart dropped. "Miss Cooper," the colonel said, "we're here about George Fletcher." George, the old man from the bus stop. My voice shook. Did something happen to him? The colonel's face was grave. "We need to talk about what you did for him." 6 months earlier, I had noticed him for the first time. I took the number 47 bus every morning at 6:30. The stop was 3 blocks from my apartment, right outside a closed-down laundromat. That's where George slept, on a flattened cardboard box, a wool blanket pulled up to his chin, his few belongings stuffed into a trash bag beside him. Most people walked past without looking. Some crossed the street to avoid him. I'd done the same thing for 2 weeks, telling myself I didn't have enough to help. I barely had enough for myself. But one morning in late March, I'd packed an extra sandwich for lunch and realized I wouldn't have time to eat it. My shift at the hospital cafeteria ran until 3 o'clock. Then I had to be at the grocery store by 4 o'clock to stock shelves until midnight. The sandwich would just go bad in my locker. George was awake when I approached. His eyes were sharp, clearer than I expected. He watched me carefully like he was used to people either ignoring him or yelling at him to move along. "Excuse me," I said, holding out the wrapped sandwich. "I made too much. You want this?" He stared at the sandwich, then at my face. For a long moment, he didn't move. "You need that more than I do," he said quietly. "That's debatable," I replied. "But I'm offering." He took it with both hands like it was something precious. "Thank you, miss." Aliyah. George Fletcher. I almost walked away then, almost went back to my routine of not seeing him, not getting involved. But something about the way he'd said thank you, with dignity, not desperation, made me pause. "Do you take your coffee black, or with sugar?" I asked. His eyebrows lifted. "Black's fine." The next morning, I brought coffee in a thermos and a banana. The morning after that, another sandwich and an apple. By the end of the first week, it had become a routine I couldn't imagine breaking. 6:15 a.m. Every single day. George was always awake, always waiting at the same spot. We'd talk for 5, maybe 10 minutes before my bus came. He'd ask about my classes. I was taking nursing courses at the community college 2 nights a week when I could afford it. I'd ask about his day, and he'd tell me stories. Strange stories. Back in my helicopter days, he'd say, staring past me at nothing, "We flew senators out to places that don't exist on maps." Or, "I worked for a 3-letter agency once. Can't tell you which one, but I can tell you those folks don't forget faces." I figured he was confused, maybe mentally ill, maybe just old and lonely, building himself a past that felt more important than sleeping on cardboard. I didn't correct him. I just listened. Other people weren't so kind. One morning in April, a businessman in an expensive suit walked past and deliberately kicked George's blanket into the gutter. I was 10 feet away, about to cross the street. "Hey!" I spun around, my voice sharp. "What's wrong with you?" The businessman didn't even slow down. "He's blocking the sidewalk." "That's somebody's grandfather," I shot back. The man kept walking. George sat quietly, pulling his blanket back from the dirty water pooling at the curb. His hands shook. From cold or anger, I couldn't tell. I helped him wring out the blanket. It smelled like mildew and exhaust fumes. "You didn't have to do that," George said softly. Yeah, I did. He looked at me for a long time. Then he smiled, a sad knowing smile. You've got a fight in you. That's good. He folded the damp blanket across his lap. You're going to need it. I didn't understand what he meant. Not then. I just handed him his coffee, same as always, and waited for the bus. By May, the routine was as automatic as breathing. Wake up at 5, make 2 sandwiches, one for George, one for myself, pack a banana, pour coffee into the thermos, walk 3 blocks, sit with George for 10 minutes, catch the 6:30 bus. It wasn't charity. It didn't feel like charity. It felt like the only thing in my life that made sense. My apartment was a studio on the 4th floor of a building that should have been condemned years ago. 300 square feet, a hot plate instead of a stove, a bathroom where the shower only worked if you kicked the pipes first. Rent was $650 a month, and I was always 2 weeks behind. The eviction notice had been taped to my door in March. I'd talked the landlord into a payment plan, an extra $40 a week until I caught up. I'd been paying it off ever since, which meant every other bill got pushed to the edge. My kitchen counter told the story. Electric bill past due. Medical debt from an emergency room visit 2 years ago in collections. Student loan payment deferred again. Cell phone 1 month from disconnection. And in the middle of all that paper, a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. I stood at the counter on a Tuesday night in late May, doing the math in my head. I'd gotten paid that morning, $280 from the hospital, another $160 from the grocery store. Subtract rent, subtract the payment plan, subtract bus fare for 2 weeks, $90 left for everything else. I opened the fridge, a carton of eggs with 3 left, half a jug of milk, some wilted lettuce I should have thrown out days ago. That was it. My stomach had been empty since lunch, but I'd learned to ignore that feeling. I'd eat tomorrow or the day after. It didn't matter. What mattered was the bread and peanut butter. Enough for another week of sandwiches for George. Maybe 2 weeks if I stretched it. I closed the fridge and leaned against it, pressing my forehead to the cold metal door. I could stop. I could keep the sandwiches for myself, save the coffee money, catch up on the electric bill before they shut it off. George would understand. He'd probably tell me to stop anyway if he knew how tight things were. But the thought of walking past that bus stop, seeing him there, not stopping. I couldn't do it. Before I continue, kindly subscribe to this channel. At the hospital cafeteria the next day, Mrs. Carter noticed. Mrs. Carter was the kitchen supervisor, a 60-something Chinese-American woman with the kind of sharp eyes that saw everything. She'd worked at the hospital for 30 years and had seen every version of struggling that existed. "Are you eating today?" Mrs. Carter asked, watching me wipe down tables during the lunch rush. "I ate breakfast," I lied. "Uh-huh." Mrs. Carter crossed her arms. "Are you feeding that homeless man again?" My shoulders stiffened. "His name is George." "I know his name, honey. I'm asking if you're feeding him instead of yourself." "I'm fine." Mrs. Carter sighed. She disappeared into the kitchen and came back 5 minutes later with a container of leftover pasta and a bread roll. She pressed it into my hands. "You eat this now. I don't want to see you passing out on my shift." Her voice softened. "He's a person." "I get it. But you know what else?" "What?" "You're a person, too." I stared at the container. My throat felt tight. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just eat." That night, lying on my mattress on the floor, I'd sold the bed frame 2 months ago to make rent. I stared at the ceiling and did the math again. If I skipped my Thursday class, I could pick up an extra shift at the grocery store, another $40. If I walked to work instead of taking the bus 3 days a week, I'd save $12. If I asked the landlord for 1 more week. My phone buzzed. A text from the electric company. Final notice. Service will be disconnected in 7 days without payment of $127. I closed my eyes. 1 more week of bringing George breakfast. That's all I'd commit to. 1 more week and then I'd have to stop. I'd explain it to him. He'd understand. I had to take care of myself first. That's what anyone would say. That's what made sense. But when Friday morning came, I still made 2 sandwiches, still poured coffee into the thermos, still walked 3 blocks to the bus stop. George was waiting, same as always. And when he split his sandwich in half and handed part of it back to me, fair is fair, he said simply. I had to turn away so he wouldn't see me crying. George wasn't at the bus stop on Monday morning. I stood there with the sandwich and thermos, scanning the empty sidewalk. His cardboard was gone. His trash bag of belongings gone. Even the damp spot where he usually slept had dried up, leaving no trace he'd ever been there. I waited until my bus came and went. Waited through the next one. By the time I finally climbed aboard the 3rd bus, I was going to be late for my shift, and my chest felt hollow. I told myself he'd just moved to a different spot. People did that. Maybe someone had hassled him. Maybe the police had cleared the block. It didn't mean anything bad had happened, but I checked the spot again that evening after work. Still nothing. Tuesday morning, empty. Wednesday, empty. By Thursday, I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach anymore. I stopped by the Mercy Street shelter on my way home from the grocery store, even though it was 10 blocks out of my way and my feet were killing me. The woman at the intake desk barely looked up. Name. I'm looking for someone. George Fletcher. Older white man, late 60s, usually sleeps near the bus stop on Clayton. We don't track people who don't check in here. Can you just look? I pressed. Please. The woman sighed and typed something into her computer. Waited, shook her head. No one by that name in our system. What about the hospitals? Is there a way to check if you family? I hesitated. I'm a friend then. No privacy laws. The woman's tone softened just slightly. Look, honey, people move around. He probably found another spot. They always do. I called 3 hospitals that night. None of them would tell me anything without a family connection or a patient ID number I didn't have. On the 7th day, I went back to the bus stop with a paper bag and a note inside. Hope you're okay. A. I left it where George usually slept and tried not to think about what it meant that I was leaving food for a ghost. That afternoon, he was there. I almost missed my stop on the bus home because I wasn't expecting to see him. But there he was, sitting on the same flattened cardboard, his trash bag beside him. Thinner than before. His face more drawn. I got off at the next stop and ran back. George! He looked up and for a second I thought he didn't recognize me. Then his face softened. Miss Aliyah. I crouched down beside him, breathing hard. Where were you? I checked shelters. I called hospitals. Had a spell. His voice was raspier than usual. I'm all right now. You don't look all right. I'm upright. That counts for something. He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's when I noticed his hand. A fresh scar across the back of it, still pink and healing. It looked surgical, too clean to be from a fall or a fight. What happened to your hand? George pulled his sleeve down quickly. Nothing. Old wound acting up. George. I'm fine. His tone left no room for argument. We sat in silence for a moment. Then George reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. White, slightly crumpled, with an address written in shaky handwriting on the front. He held it out to me. If something happens to me, he said quietly, I need you to mail this. I stared at the envelope. What do you mean? If something happens. Just promise me. You're not going anywhere. Aliyah. His voice was firm. Serious. Promise me. I took the envelope. It was heavier than I expected. I promise. George nodded slowly like a weight had lifted. Good girl. I wanted to ask what was inside, wanted to ask why he'd been gone, where he'd been, what that scar really meant. But my bus was coming, and George had already closed his eyes, leaning back against the brick wall like the conversation had exhausted him. I slipped the envelope into my bag and caught the bus. I didn't open it. Not yet. 2 weeks later, George collapsed. I was handing him the thermos of coffee when his hand started shaking. Not the usual tremor from cold or age. This was different, violent. The thermos slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the sidewalk, coffee spilling across the concrete. George! He tried to say something, but his words came out slurred. His eyes rolled back and then his whole body folded, knees buckling, shoulders crumpling forward. I caught him before his head hit the pavement. Somebody call 911. I screamed. A woman across the street pulled out her phone. A man in jogging gear stopped, hesitated, then kept running. 2 people getting off the bus just stared. I lowered George onto his side, my hand shaking. His breathing was shallow, erratic. His lips were turning pale. Stay with me, I whispered. Come on, George. Stay with me. Before I continue, kindly subscribe to this channel. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. Felt like 7 hours. I climbed into the back without asking permission. One of the paramedics tried to stop me. Are you family? But I was already inside, gripping George's hand as they loaded him onto the gurney. I'm all he's got, I said. The paramedic didn't argue. At the hospital, everything moved too fast and too slow at the same time. They wheeled George through double doors into the emergency room. A nurse took my arm and guided me to a waiting area. Green chairs bolted to the floor, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a TV on mute showing the morning news. I sat down, realized I was still holding the empty thermos. My shift at the cafeteria had started 20 minutes ago. I pulled out my phone and texted Mrs. Carter. Emergency. Can't make it today. I'm sorry. Mrs. Carter replied immediately. You okay? George collapsed. I'm at the hospital. Which one? St. Vincent's. I'll cover your shift. Keep me posted. I closed my eyes and tried not to cry. An hour passed, then another. Finally, a nurse called my name. Aliyah Cooper? I jumped up. That's me. The nurse led me to a desk where a woman in scrubs sat behind a computer looking exhausted and annoyed in equal measure. Her name tag read R. Williams, patient intake. You're here for George Fletcher, the woman asked without looking up. Yes. Is he okay? He's stable. Severe dehydration, possible stroke. We're running tests. She clicked through something on her screen. But we have a problem. He has no insurance card, no ID, no emergency contact. We need to transfer him to the county overflow. My stomach dropped. What does that mean? It means he'll get care, but not here. County General has space. County General is a nightmare. I've heard the stories. People wait for days. It's policy, the woman said flatly. Without proof of insurance or ability to pay. He's a veteran, I said, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. Check the VA system. The woman finally looked up. Do you have proof of that? No, but... Then I can't check. We need documentation, a VA card, discharge papers, something. My mind raced. I thought about the envelope George had given me, still sitting in my bag at home. Thought about the stories he'd told. The helicopters, the 3-letter agencies, the senators. I'd always assumed he was confused. But what if he wasn't? I'm his niece, I said. The woman's eyebrows rose. His niece? Yes. And you don't have any of his paperwork. He's been living on the street. He doesn't keep paperwork in his pocket. I leaned forward. But I know he served. I know he has benefits. Just run the check, please. The woman stared at me for a long moment, clearly skeptical. Then someone behind us, a doctor in a white coat, South Asian, maybe mid-40s, spoke up. Run it, Rachel. The intake woman turned. Dr. Patel. Just run it as a courtesy. Dr. Patel looked at me. If there's a match, we keep him. If not, county. Fair, I nodded quickly. Fair, Rachel sighed and started typing. The wait felt endless. 30 seconds that stretched into infinity. Then the computer beeped. Rachel's expression changed. She leaned closer to the screen, reading something. Her jaw tightened. What? Dr. Patel asked. There's a match. George Allen Fletcher, born 1957, honorable discharge 2001. She scrolled down. Service record is heavily redacted. Almost everything's blacked out. Dr. Patel moved behind the desk to look. What does that mean? I asked. It means his service was classified, Rachel said quietly. She looked at me differently now, less annoyed, more confused. What exactly did your uncle do in the military? My throat felt dry. I don't know. He didn't talk about it much. That was true in a way. He talked about it constantly. I just hadn't believed him. Dr. Patel straightened up. Transfer him to Ward C. I'll handle the VA billing authorization myself. Are you sure? Rachel asked. If the VA disputes. They won't. Not with a record like this. He looked at me. You can see him in about an hour. He's going to need someone checking in on him. I will, I said. Every day. I sat in the waiting room until they let me into his room. George was awake, barely. And 4 drip fed into his arm. Monitors beeped softly beside the bed. He looked smaller than before, swallowed up by white sheets and hospital machinery. Hey, I said softly, pulling a chair close. His eyes opened, focused on my face. He tried to smile. You didn't have to. Yeah, I did. He reached for my hand, the one without the 4. His grip was weak but steady. You've got that fight, he murmured. Good. I stayed until visiting hours ended. Stayed through the shift I was supposed to work at the grocery store. Stayed until a nurse gently told me I had to leave, that George needed rest, that I could come back in the morning. Walking out through the hospital lobby, I passed the cafeteria where I worked. Mrs. Carter was still there wiping down tables at the end of her shift. Our eyes met through the glass doors. Mrs. Carter just nodded. I nodded back. On the bus ride home, I stared out the window and thought about the look on Rachel's face when she'd seen George's file. Thought about all those redacted lines, all that classified history. I thought about the envelope. And for the first time, I wondered if George's stories hadn't been stories at all. George was transferred to a VA long-term care facility 3 weeks later. It was across town, 2 buses, and a 15-minute walk from my apartment. I couldn't visit as often as I wanted, but I went when I could, twice a week, sometimes 3 times if my schedule allowed. The facility was nicer than I expected. Clean rooms, staff who actually seemed to care. George had his own bed, his own window. He was eating regular meals, taking medication, sleeping under real blankets. He looked better, stronger. His mind seemed clearer, too. On one visit in early July, he was sitting up in bed when I arrived, a notebook open on his lap. He was writing something, slow, careful handwriting that filled page after page. What's that? I asked, setting down the small bag I'd brought. Cookies from the hospital cafeteria. Mrs. Carter had sent them. George looked up. My memory's going, he said simply. Writing down things that matter, things that are true. He closed the notebook and held it out to me. I want you to have this. George. Just take it, please. I took the notebook. It was small, pocket-sized with a worn leather cover. I flipped through the pages. Names, dates, places, strings of numbers I didn't understand. Some entries were clear. Others were hurried, almost frantic. What is all this? If anyone ever asks, George said, you'll know what's true. I didn't understand. But I slipped the notebook into my bag next to the envelope he'd given me weeks ago. 2 pieces of a puzzle I couldn't see yet. My life was getting slightly better. The hospital had given me a small raise, 20 cents an hour, but it was something. I'd finally caught up on rent. The electric company had agreed to a payment plan. I could breathe a little easier, and I'd used part of my first full paycheck to buy George something. I pulled it out of the bag, a thick, warm blanket, navy blue, soft fleece. George stared at it, then at me, his eyes filled with tears. No one's done this much for me in 20 years, he whispered. I draped the blanket over his legs. Well, somebody should have. He reached for my hand and held it for a long time, not saying anything. Some things didn't need words. George died on a Tuesday in late August. The facility called me at 6 o'clock in the morning. I was getting ready for my shift, standing in my tiny kitchen making coffee when my phone rang. Miss Cooper, this is Pine Valley VA Care. I'm calling about George Fletcher. My hand froze on the coffee pot. He passed peacefully in his sleep last night. Heart failure. I'm very sorry for your loss. The words didn't make sense at first. I heard them, but they floated somewhere outside my body, not connecting to anything real. Miss Cooper, are you there? Yes. My voice sounded strange, distant. I'm here. We'll need you to come in to handle his personal effects. There's not much. The blanket you brought him, the notebook, a few clothes, and we'll need to discuss arrangements. Arrangements? For his remains. If there's no family. I'll be there in an hour. I hung up, stood in my kitchen, staring at nothing. The coffee pot was still in my hand. George was gone. The man I'd brought breakfast to every morning for 6 months. The man who'd told impossible stories and split his sandwich with me when I was hungry. The man who'd looked at me like I mattered, like what I did mattered. Gone. I set the coffee pot down carefully and sat on the floor. I didn't cry. I couldn't. The grief was too big, too heavy. It sat in my chest like a stone. I called in sick to work. Took the bus across town to the facility. They gave me a plastic bag with George's belongings, the blue blanket folded neatly, 3 shirts, a pair of worn shoes, the notebook, and at the bottom, a small envelope addressed to me in George's handwriting. I opened it right there in the hallway. Inside was a single photograph. George, decades younger, maybe in his 40s, standing in a military dress uniform, 3 rows of medals across his chest. On either side of him, 2 men in expensive suits. I recognized one of them, a senator who'd been in the news recently, now retired. The other man I didn't know, but he had that look. Power. Authority. I flipped the photograph over. 3 words written on the back in George's shaky handwriting. Remember the girl. My hands trembled. I went home, sat on my mattress on the floor, pulled out the other envelope, the sealed one George had given me months ago, the one I'd promised to mail if something happened to him. I opened it. Inside was a letter handwritten on lined paper and another copy of the photograph. The letter read, "To whoever reads this, probably General Victoria Ashford, if the address still works. If you're reading this, I'm gone. I don't have much to leave behind. No family, no money, nothing that matters to the world. But I want you to know about someone who mattered to me. Her name is Aliyah Cooper. For 6 months, she brought me breakfast every single morning. Not because she had to, not because anyone was watching. She did it because she saw me when everyone else looked away. I was a ghost. The system forgot me 20 years ago, and I was fine with that. But she didn't forget. She didn't let me disappear. This country took everything I gave and then lost me in the paperwork. But this girl, this struggling, broke, beautiful girl, she gave me dignity when I had nothing. Remember her like she remembered me. George Fletcher, GS14, retired. I read it 3 times. Each time the words felt heavier. I looked at the address on the envelope, General Victoria Ashford, Pentagon, Office of the Inspector General. George hadn't been confused, hadn't been embellishing. He'd been telling the truth the whole time. The next morning, I went to the post office, stood in line for 20 minutes with the envelope in my hand. When I got to the counter, I almost didn't mail it. Almost took it back home and forgot about it. But I'd made a promise. I need to send this, I said, sliding the envelope across the counter. The postal worker weighed it. $5.60. I paid with crumpled bills from my wallet. I watched the woman stamp it, toss it into a bin with hundreds of other letters. It disappeared into the pile like it had never existed. Walking out of the post office, I felt hollow. No one was going to read that letter. Even if they did, no one was going to care. George was just another forgotten veteran, another name in a system that had already failed him. His letter would get filed away somewhere, and that would be the end of it. I went to his memorial service that Friday. It was held at the VA facility, just me, a chaplain, and one nurse who'd worked George's wing. No family, no military honor guard, no flag. The chaplain said generic words about service and sacrifice. I barely heard them. When it was over, I walked back to the bus stop where I'd met George 8 months ago. Someone else was sleeping there now, a younger man, maybe 30, with a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry, anything helps." I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where George used to sleep. Then I went home. 2 weeks passed. I went back to work, back to my double shifts, my night classes, my empty apartment. Life kept moving forward because it had to. I didn't think about the letter, didn't let myself hope it mattered. Until one morning in mid-September when I heard the knock on my door. It was 6 a.m. I was running late, pulling on my hospital uniform, gulping down instant coffee. The knock was firm. Official. I opened the door. 3 people in military dress uniforms stood in the hallway. 1 colonel, 2 junior officers. Their brass buttons caught the dim hallway light. The colonel was tall, white, maybe 55. His face was serious, but not unkind. "Alia Cooper?" My heart hammered in my chest. "Yes. I'm Colonel Hayes. These are Officers Martinez and Carter. We're here about George Fletcher." The world tilted. "We need to ask you some questions," the colonel continued. "General Ashford sent us." My voice came out barely above a whisper. "General Ashford?" "Yes, ma'am. She received Mr. Fletcher's letter." He paused. "And she wants to meet you." I had never been on a plane before. Colonel Hayes arranged everything. A flight from the local airport to Ronald Reagan Washington National. A car waiting at the terminal. A hotel room in Arlington. Small but clean, nicer than anywhere I'd ever stayed. "General Ashford will see you tomorrow morning at 0900, Hayes said as we drove through DC traffic. Pentagon E-ring. "Don't worry, we'll escort you through security." I stared out the window at monuments and marble buildings. Everything felt enormous, overwhelming. Wrong. "Why does she want to meet me?" I asked quietly. Hayes glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "That's her story to tell, Miss Cooper, not mine." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the hotel bed, the softest mattress I'd ever felt, and stared at the ceiling, thinking about George, wondering what I'd walked into, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake mailing that letter. At 8:30 the next morning, Hayes picked me up. We drove to the Pentagon. Security took 20 minutes. Metal detectors, ID checks, a visitor badge clipped to my borrowed blazer. Mrs. Carter had lent it to me along with a pair of dress pants that were slightly too long. I felt like I was wearing a costume. Hayes led me through endless corridors, polished floors, flags hanging from walls, uniforms everywhere, people walking with purpose, carrying folders, speaking in low, urgent voices. We stopped outside a door marked Office of the Inspector General. Hayes knocked twice. "Come in," a woman's voice called. The office was smaller than I expected. A desk, bookshelves, flags in the corner, and behind the desk, a woman in a crisp uniform with 4 stars on her shoulders. General Victoria Ashford was in her early 60s, silver hair pulled back, sharp eyes that measured me in a single glance. She stood when we entered. "Miss Cooper." Ashford came around the desk and extended her hand. "Thank you for coming." I shook it. The general's grip was firm but not crushing. "Please sit." I sat. Hayes remained standing by the door. Ashford returned to her chair and opened a file on her desk. I could see George's name on the tab. "I received Mr. Fletcher's letter 3 weeks ago," Ashford began. It was the first concrete proof we'd had in 15 years that he was alive. She paused. "And then proof that he died." My throat tightened. I didn't know what else to do with it. "You did exactly the right thing." Ashford leaned forward. "George Fletcher was one of the finest intelligence officers this country ever produced. He flew classified missions during some of our most sensitive operations. Desert Storm, Kosovo, missions that still don't exist on paper." She tapped the file. "When he retired in 2001, he should have had full benefits, full support. Instead, he fell through the cracks." "How?" I asked. "PTSD. A bureaucratic error that lost his file for 2 years. By the time we found it, he'd already disappeared. The VA declared him missing. No one followed up." Ashford's voice hardened. "We failed him. He told me stories," I said quietly, "about helicopters and senators and missions. I thought he was confused. He wasn't." Ashford pulled out the photograph, the one from George's letter. This was taken in 1998. That's Senator Kirkland on the left, Deputy Director Monroe on the right. George had just extracted them from a collapsing situation in the Balkans. Saved their lives. She looked at me. "He saved a lot of lives. And then we forgot him." The weight in my chest grew heavier. "I'm conducting an audit," Ashford continued, "Inspector General review of how the VA handles veterans with classified service records. George's case is the worst I've found, but it's not the only one. There are others, dozens, maybe hundreds, lost in the system." "Why are you telling me this?" Ashford closed the file. "Because George's letter wasn't about him. It was about you." She met my eyes. "He wanted me to remember what you did, and I want to honor that. I just brought him breakfast." "Exactly." Ashford's voice softened. "You saw a person everyone else had erased. You gave him dignity when the system gave him nothing. That matters, Miss Cooper. That matters more than you know." I didn't know what to say. "I want to make this right," Ashford said. "Establish a memorial fund in George's name. Reform the VA's tracking systems for classified veterans. And I want you to testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee about what happened." My stomach dropped. "Testify? Tell them what you told me. What George meant. What it looks like when the system fails." Ashford leaned back. "I can push policy changes from inside. But your voice, someone who actually lived this, that's what makes people listen." "I'm nobody," I whispered. "Why would they listen to me?" Ashford's expression changed, became something fierce and certain. "Rank measures authority," she said quietly. "Character measures worth." She let that sit for a moment. "They'll listen," Ashford continued. "Because you're the one person in this whole story who did the right thing, not for recognition, not for reward, just because it needed doing. She stood. Will you do it? I thought about George, about his handwriting on that letter. Remember the girl? I took a shaky breath. Yes. They had 3 weeks to prepare. General Ashford's team descended on me like a well-oiled machine. Attorneys, communication specialists, policy advisors. They set me up in a small office at the Pentagon Annex and walked me through what a congressional hearing actually meant. You'll sit at the witness table, one attorney explained, showing me photographs of the committee room. Senators will ask questions. Some will be supportive. Others will challenge you. Stay calm. Stick to your story. My story, I repeated. What you did for George Fletcher, how the system failed him, why it matters. But as the days went on, I realized they didn't want my whole story. They wanted a version of it. We should probably downplay the poverty angle, the communications director said during one prep session. She was young, white, wearing a blazer that probably cost more than my rent. Focus on patriotism, service. Keep it positive. Poverty isn't positive, I asked. It's just, it can be polarizing. Some senators might see it as political. It's not political. It's true. The woman smiled tightly. We're just trying to keep the message clean. I looked at General Ashford, who'd been silent in the corner of the room. What do you think? I asked her directly. Ashford set down her coffee. I think if we erase who you are, we erase why George's letter mattered. She looked at her team. She speaks her truth or this is just theater. The communications director opened her mouth to argue, then thought better of it. Yes. The hearing was scheduled for October 12th. I flew back to DC the night before. Couldn't sleep. Spent hours staring at my testimony, reading it over and over until the words stopped making sense. Mrs. Carter had called me that afternoon. Are you nervous? Terrified. Good. Means you care. Mrs. Carter's voice was warm. Just tell them what happened. They can't argue with the truth. They're senators. They can argue with anything. Then let them. You'll still be right. The morning of the hearing, I put on the suit Ashford's team had bought for me. Navy blue, professional. It fit perfectly, but it didn't feel like mine. I stared at myself in the hotel mirror and barely recognized the person looking back. Colonel Hayes drove me to Capitol Hill. We entered through a side entrance, avoiding the reporters already gathering outside. The Senate Armed Services Committee room was bigger than I'd imagined. Tiered seating rising up like a courtroom. Cameras in the back, press filling the benches, senators trickling in, talking amongst themselves, ignoring me. I sat at the witness table. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against the wood. General Ashford testified first. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Ashford began, her voice carrying through the room. George Allen Fletcher served this nation with distinction for 23 years. He flew combat missions in Desert Storm, evacuated diplomats under fire in Kosovo, transported high-value assets through hostile territory in operations that remain classified to this day. She paused, letting that sink in. And when he retired, we lost him. Not in combat, not overseas. We lost him in paperwork, in bureaucratic errors, in a system that failed to track veterans whose service was too classified to fit neatly into our databases. Ashford opened George's file. By the time we realized he was missing, George Fletcher was living on the street, sleeping at a bus stop, forgotten by the country he'd served. One senator leaned forward. Senator Patricia Drummond, a Democrat from Massachusetts known for veteran advocacy. General, how many cases like this exist? We've identified 47 so far, Senator. We believe there are more. Murmurs rippled through the room. Then it was my turn. I walked to the witness table on legs that felt like water, sat down. A microphone was adjusted in front of me. Every eye in the room was on me. Senator Drummond spoke first. Miss Cooper, thank you for being here. I understand you knew George Fletcher personally. Yes. Can you tell us about that relationship? My throat was dry. I looked down at my written testimony, then pushed it aside. I didn't need it. I met George in March, I began. He slept at the bus stop I used every morning. I started bringing him breakfast. A sandwich, coffee, nothing fancy. My voice steadied as I spoke. I didn't know he was a veteran. He told me stories about flying helicopters, about missions, but I thought he was confused, maybe sick. I didn't believe him. I paused. But I brought him breakfast anyway because it didn't matter if the stories were true. He was still a person. Senator Drummond nodded. And you did this for how long? 6 months. Every single day. Why? The question hung in the air. Because no one else did, I said simply. And because he was someone's grandfather, someone's friend, someone who mattered, even if the world forgot. Another senator spoke up. Senator Robert Gaines, a Republican from Texas. Older, skeptical expression. Miss Cooper, that's admirable, but we're here to discuss policy. The VA budget is already strained. Are you suggesting taxpayers should fund care for every homeless person in America? The room went quiet. I looked at him, felt something shift inside me. Fear becoming anger, anger becoming clarity. I'm not suggesting anything about every homeless person, I said, my voice firm. I'm talking about George Fletcher specifically, a man who flew senators to safety, who risked his life for this country. You made him a promise when you sent him into danger. I leaned forward slightly. I kept my promise with a sandwich. You kept yours with paperwork that buried him. The room went completely silent. Senator Gaines stiffened, opened his mouth, closed it. Reporters in the back were scribbling furiously. Senator Drummond cleared her throat. Miss Cooper, do you believe the system can be fixed? I believe it has to be, I said. Because if we only care about people when we find out they used to be powerful, when we discover they have medals and classified files, then we've already lost. My voice cracked slightly. George Fletcher wasn't a hero because of his service record. He was a hero because even when the world forgot him, he still woke up every day with dignity. I looked around the room. He deserved better. They all deserve better. And if you can't see that, if you need me to sit here and prove that veterans are worth caring about, then I don't know what I'm doing here. No one spoke. Then General Ashford stood. Mr. Chairman, if I may. The chairman nodded. Ashford stepped to the microphone. Effective immediately, the Inspector General's office is establishing a dedicated task force for veterans with classified service records. We're allocating $5 million to the George Fletcher Memorial Fund, which will provide emergency support and case management. She looked at me. And I'm appointing Miss Cooper as community liaison. She'll oversee grant distribution and veteran outreach. My eyes widened. What? Ashford smiled slightly. She knows what accountability looks like. The hearing continued for another hour. Questions about implementation, oversight, budget allocation, but I barely heard it. When it was over, reporters swarmed me in the hallway. Cameras, microphones, questions shouted from every direction. Miss Cooper, how does it feel to change policy? Are you going to work with the VA full-time? Do you have a message for other veterans? Colonel Hayes and 2 other officers formed a barrier, guiding me through the crowd, but one reporter's voice cut through. How does it feel to be famous? I stopped, turned. I don't want to be famous, I said quietly. I want George to be remembered. That soundbite played on every news channel that night. 6 months later, everything had changed and nothing had changed. I still lived in the same studio apartment, still took the same bus to work. But now I worked at the VA hospital 3 days a week as a nurse's aide. I'd finally finished my certification and spent the other 2 days managing the George Fletcher Memorial Fund. The fund had grown beyond what anyone expected. $5 million from the Department of Defense, another $2 million from private donations after my testimony went viral. We'd awarded grants to 10 organizations in the first round: homeless veteran outreach programs, PTSD counseling centers, a legal aid clinic helping former service members navigate VA bureaucracy. I sat in a small office at the VA hospital and reviewed applications for the second round of grants. 43 requests. I couldn't fund them all, but I'd fund as many as I could. My phone buzzed. A text from General Ashford: "Good work on the grant selections. Coffee next week?" I smiled and typed back, "Yes. I'll bring the sandwiches." I'd become unlikely friends with the general over the past 6 months. Ashford had a brother who'd been a Marine killed in Iraq in 2004. She understood what it meant when the system failed people. That afternoon, I was making rounds when I noticed a young woman sitting alone in the waiting area. Early 20s, brown hair, wearing an army jacket 3 sizes too big. She was staring at the floor, arms wrapped around herself. I grabbed 2 cups of coffee and sat down beside her. "Do you take it black or with hope?" I asked gently. The woman looked up, startled, then smiled slightly. "Sugar, please." I handed her the cup. "I'm Aliyah. I work here." "Sarah. I'm trying to get my benefits sorted out. They keep telling me to come back, fill out more forms." "What branch?" "Army, medic. Discharged last year." I saw myself in Sarah's exhausted eyes, saw George in the way she held herself, trying to maintain dignity while the system ground her down. "Come with me." I took Sarah to my office, pulled out the notebook George had given me, filled with names and numbers and processes for navigating VA bureaucracy. "We're going to fix this," I said. "Right now." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Why are you helping me?" I thought about George, about that first morning at the bus stop. Because somebody taught me. Small things aren't small. Later that week, I stood at Arlington National Cemetery. George had been reburied here with full military honors. His headstone read George Allen Fletcher, Intelligence Officer, U.S. Army, 1957 to 2025. I knelt and placed a peanut butter sandwich on the stone, wrapped in wax paper, same as always. "I kept my promise," I whispered. The autumn wind moved through the trees. I stayed for a long time, remembering. 1 year after George's death, the George Fletcher Memorial Fund had served over 2,000 veterans. I continued working as a VA nurse and fund director. I'd moved to a better apartment. Nothing fancy, just a place with heat that worked and a kitchen with a real stove. I was saving money for the first time in my life. But every morning, I still woke up at 5:30, still made my coffee the same way, still took the same bus route, even though I didn't have to anymore. One Tuesday morning, I stood at that same bus stop, the place where I'd first met George. A young girl stood beside me, maybe 16, part of a mentorship program I'd started through the fund. I handed the girl a brown paper bag for later. The girl peeked inside. A sandwich, a banana, a bottle of water. "Someone taught me," I said quietly, "that small things aren't small." The girl nodded, not quite understanding yet, but she would. The bus pulled up. We climbed aboard together. As the bus rolled away from the stop, I looked out the window at the empty sidewalk where George used to sleep. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw him there, smiling, tipping an invisible hat. Then the bus turned the corner and he was gone. But what he'd taught me remained. Kindness doesn't need an audience. Fairness doesn't need permission. An opportunity starts with seeing people the world wants to forget. The George Fletcher Memorial Fund has served over 2,000 veterans in its first year. Aliyah Cooper continues to work as a VA nurse and fund director. In 2026, Congress passed the Fletcher Act, requiring the VA to establish tracking protocols for veterans with classified service records. What small act of kindness will you choose today? Someone near you needs to be seen. Let us know in the comments what you'll do. And don't forget to subscribe if this story moved you. There are so many more stories of everyday heroes waiting to be told.